thanks very much to everybody for joining us for what is the sort of final session of the day here as part of day 2 of the program here at the International Investors Lounge. ESG has appeared in nearly all of the discussion, in fact in all of the discussions that we've had. And we really wanted to do a session that was around some of the practical elements as well of what we're thinking about in terms of the investment side, but also what we mean in terms of implementation and how we move this forward from a discussion about being this is something we'd like to do to something that we're actually doing and implementing. And there will be at 6 o'clock, there is a very hard cut-off, which is for drinks. And so as soon as anybody hears glasses jingling and heading this way, signal to me. And in fact, if it gets to 6, I will be shouting for them anyway. So that will be our reward. For those who don't know me, my name's Richard Betts. I'm the publisher at Real Asset Media, responsible for the content. And we produce Real Asset Insight that looks at the main market trends, sectors. We look at it mainly through the lens of analysis, research, thought leadership, strategy. So the kind of things that will be influencing markets going forward rather than necessarily spending our time looking at what happened last week. We also produce Impact, very relevant to this session, which looks at social impact, ESG, purpose-driven investment, and it's the focus of it is very much to drive it forward. So we take a position. Impact is around positively driving forward change. That's me. Rio, let's start with you. Just a quick introduction from everybody so that we all know which side of the fence everybody's on, and then we'll dig into the detail. Rio.
Hi everybody, my name is Ryu Konishi. I'm with LaSalle Investment Management. I'm a Managing Director in Sustainable Investments.
Hi everyone, I'm Christina Foster. I'm the Fund Manager for Real Estate Debt at Schroders Capital. I'm the lead for ESG and Impact Integration.
Hi everyone, Robbie Epsom. I'm the EMEA Head of Sustainability at CBRE Investment Management. I lead sustainability across all our investment strategies in Europe and come from a background in sustainability consultancy as well. So I've been doing sustainability advisory for about 15 years now.
Great, Martijn.
I'm Martijn Horsman. I'm the Sustainable Development Manager by Redefco, and Redefco is managing an asset portfolio, a pan-European portfolio. And my job is to help all my colleagues in all these European countries to really do the trick instead of talking about it.
Great, Adrian.
Adrian Karczewicz, I represent Skanska, which is one of the biggest construction development companies in the world. And my role is to sell our assets in Central Europe, so I'm basically representing the capital markets from Skanska.
Great. Rio, it would be a terrible waste for you to have come all the way from the States and for us not to ask you, I guess, some of the differences in sort of global approaches to ESG. So I'd be really interested to get your perspective, and then we can see whether or not that's challenged by our views here in Europe, perhaps. Rio.
Sure, I think for one thing, in terms of the level of readily available, approaches, I think is one way to characterize it. Certainly in the EU, the UK, there are many regulations, and there have been a lot of disclosure, right? Transparency and disclosure to induce activity, and there certainly is a lot of market participants that are very active. In a North American context, it's approached through the tax code in terms of incentives and sticks and carrots, right? And there's a real financial ramification because there's an actual carbon tax that's been enacted by law, and then there's an incentive to try to induce market participants to actually do something about it. And so that is perhaps one of the biggest differences. There are certainly degrees of difference in terms of readily available data, particularly at a citywide level. So each and every one of us as a market participant may have our respective levels of information because we're all trying to figure out our own respective transition plan. But at a citywide level, that's another level of complexity in order to be able to actually implement and compare, right, relative to, because ultimately you want to be able to compare yourself against some relative benchmark in terms of actual performance.
So does that mean, Rio, that because you've got that sort of, detailed data at a city level, that actually maybe there may be some elements where you're ahead of what we're doing in Europe, and I'd be interested to hear that, or what's your sense of that?
For one example, the regulatory technical standard of the EU taxonomy requires a 30% energy use intensity reduction in 3 years' time, or on a post-retrofit basis, post-CapEx basis, you can prove out that you're in the top 15% of your city's building stock for that property type use. The latter half of that equation, in order to be able to prove that out, you need city level data. It's a lot easier if you have Energy Star Portfolio Manager across the United States, or if you have, not even in North America, but you have a neighbor's energy system in Australia. There are data sets out there in the world that are more transparent, readily available, at a national level. And certainly I think those are the types of aspirations that the EU should try to advocate for, because that's what's needed, the evidencing of all of this information.
And Robbie, I know you were, in the consultancy side before looking at this. So I suppose, how do you see that difference between, what's happening in the US, what's happening here in Europe?
I think one of the key differences that I see is, I like to say that Europe's very much past the why. So as a consultant, I spent the first 10 years of my career trying to convince businesses why they should do this sort of thing. That conversation's firmly changed in Europe now, so we are past the why, we're into the kind of the how and the when. And I think, taking the example of kind of things like the EU taxonomy, the way regulations now sort of work in Europe is, it's great when you get regulation, and we will obviously do what we need to do, but actually we're seeing the market take the things that are coming out of regulation, like EU taxonomy, like SFDR, and they're using that as best practice. So they're taking things like the KPIs you mentioned, top 15%, EPCA, that 30% reduction in primary energy demand, that is becoming KPIs that just become best practice. So they are adopting it because they're past the why, but they're looking for frameworks where they can start to compare like for like. So GRESB has done very well organically in terms of giving us that analysis, that peer benchmarking, but things like EU taxonomy, SFDR, the principal adverse impacts, that's now given us a set of KPIs that the regulators understand, that the market likes and has adopted, which empowers us to start making decisions on it. Even things like the definition of a zero-emission building. Like, these are now definitions that we can define and we can compare. So I think we're past the why in Europe. From a consultancy background, when I was working with US corporates, there's still quite a lot of this is why we need to do it, trying to quantify it, but I completely agree, the transparency around the data, that's very useful. And I think with EPCs, we've got a lot of work on harmonization to do across Europe.
Okay, good. And Christina, have you got a perspective on that?
So it's slightly different on the debt side, because obviously we are trying to, you talked about GRESB, you mentioned GRESB, it doesn't work for real estate debt, it's not covered. They tried to do it, they didn't get take up. So you've got lenders who want to drive an ESG impact or sustainable strategy, but everyone has their own interpretation and there's no consistency across the debt funders. So what you're trying to do is we have to not only look at the asset level, we also have to underwrite the social responsibility of your borrower. So, and there's no guidance on that. We all are trying to look at our own different kind of measures and exclusion lists and tests on those borrowers and how they behave within their asset or how they integrate with their tenants. So it's a slightly nuanced position. We're definitely one step behind equity because of that lack of control, but we're learning from equity. So we're in a great position to let the equity guys, the direct investors, test the market, work out the best way to do it, and then we're leveraging off that experience. So
okay, good, because obviously the debt side is a really important part of how we drive that transition, really.
And it is changing. Sorry to interrupt. It is changing because as a debt fund, our capital raising, our investors are driving that requirement. So originally, everyone wants, I'm not being rude, but did start off as a kind of a question and a tick box answer. But now we're actually having pension funds who are looking at bespoke impact or sustainable strategies, and that's the next level of achievement in terms of a strategy. And it's quite interesting how that's really changed in the last kind of 6 months in terms of taking it to more of an Article 9 level of degree of testing as opposed to Article 8 in terms of SFDR.
Okay, good. So that's a really recent change that you're seeing already.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Martijn, I wanted to pick up a little bit in terms of the data side, because obviously in order to implement and to change things, you've got to be able to, in some ways, have those benchmarks, have that data available for you to look at. So how do you manage that when you're looking at, the Redevco portfolio, for example? What do you need in terms of metrics to be able to make those changes?
Well, what we do is we collect all the energy data from our assets. It's all mostly retail assets, and you have to make sure that everybody is working together with you to make sure that you can get these data, and then you can work with the data and you can mirror it to, for instance, the CREM targets. So if you would have your business plan for a year, you could especially see which tenants, which contracts might be expiring, would you be redeveloping or refurbishing maybe an asset before you can rent it out again, and what could you then do to make it better? So we really rely on CREM data, and we would like to bring them directly into the in the energy use intensity of 2040 to make sure that it's not stranded within 10 years or so. And then on the embodied carbon front, we also make sure that we get to the lowest embodied carbon as possible, and we try to aim for lower than the lowest possible, because you are actually redeveloping assets, and you're doing projects that will be ready after maybe 3 years, and when you finish it after 3 years, you do not want it to be according to the standard of 3 years ago. So you really need to look forward, and that brings a lot of imagination and creativity with it. And at some point, that really goes well, and in some other projects, that just doesn't work at that moment. So.
Okay, good. Adrian, I wanted. We'll pick up some more on what's happening in the development side, what you're doing, but I just wanted to pick on Warsaw One, just in terms of, what you're actually implementing there, what you've done, so that we can get our idea of some of the practical things that you as a developer are doing.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So we are jumping a bit into the circular economy from the subject of standardization. So just to pick up on this, what you said, it's interesting to see this dynamic, yes? Europe versus US, where in US you start from, let's say, standardization of data, and then you have this encouragement and maybe some, as you say, why to do something. And in Europe we are starting from why, however we don't have the standardized data. And now we're getting this, clusters where everyone has his own data. Yes. So when even I was at GRI in Paris, and there was a question to one of the CEOs by this someone who was leading the discussion, and she said, like, okay, we have our own data, and we rely on our own data, but how we can compare this with someone else? Yes, this is the biggest problem. So that's I really believe this is the.
I will add though, just because you have the data doesn't mean you know what to do with it.
Yeah.
That's the other problem.
True, but the transparency that you have in US, it's like one step ahead of Europe. Yes?
Yeah.
So that's better step than to start from encouraging and then working on the data.
Yeah.
Anyways, in our case, what we have done, we have actually, of course, coverage in different. We have different regions. So we are present in US, north in Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and in Central Europe. So we rely a lot on our experience in Scandinavia, in Northern Europe, where we have went through some curve of learning how to really apply the circular economy. So with this help from our colleagues from Scandinavia, we have already bought 2 properties, one in Prague, in Czech Republic, one in Warsaw, and this is the one in Warsaw. And both of them, however, in this case, this is a tower, yes? So basically, we have secured a tower in the strict city center of Warsaw, where we have applied the most advanced technology. So we're using like scanners to go through the building, and we basically scanned each centimeter of the wall, toilet, elevators, halls. So we collected the data and we created the twin to this building that we are going to demolish. Yes. And as you know, the EU taxonomy is actually conditioning the certification if you basically reuse 70% of the material. So, it's not about recycling; it's actually about reusing. So that's why you basically create this model so you can analyze which elements you can basically take and use in other properties. So this is what we actually have done. So we have started to talk, of course, to some of the suppliers. So, for example, the windows, we have, like great windows. The building is from like beginning of 90s. Yes, so the building is like 25 years old. So we have still very good windows. So we're talking to Saint-Gobain, and Saint-Gobain is very interested to buy the windows back, yes, from us. But we want to use tiles, for example, from toilets on another property and create some kind of a mosaic on the walls, yes? So this is about reusing, yes? At the same time, some materials which you can't reuse. We have a program right now on the basis of this cooperation with UNICEF and some other organizations, United Nations. So we are providing some equipment to Ukraine. So if we have some doors, some partition walls that are much needed as materials or some equipment in Ukraine, so we're going to ship that to Ukraine. So this is about creating as much as you can from the buildings that you buy, and you want to simply improve the whole environment. So it's about basically, in this case, as you see, we have 85-90% of the materials will be reused, recycled. Yes, so that's our aim. The same we have in the Czech Republic, similar program on a smaller property, but this is what we are running. So Richard gave me this moment to basically bring a bit of a different topic, but very much connected to the subject.
Yeah, and I think the circularity side of it is really important. And maybe with you, Robbie, just in terms of elements like recycling, like materiality, like biodiversity, those kinds of things that have different strengths in different regions. How are you seeing that? Is there a growing focus from investors now on all of those elements?
Yeah, I mean, I think up until probably now, over the last, when sustainability went mainstream back in 2019, and I like to say entered the boardroom, so to speak, it was very much net zero, greenhouse gas mitigation, climate resilience, and that sort of stayed the main focus. Social value, biodiversity, whole life carbon, carbon removal, all these things are now rising up the agenda. The focus I try and kind of keep us on is still on net zero, but not because the other things aren't important, but because if you can get a strong net zero framework in place, it creates a very good foundation, both for the data, but also the processes that you put in place to address those risks, those opportunities you identify, that you can slot water, waste, biodiversity, whole life carbon, all those things into. I think the points on circular economy are also really important, because we find ourselves, as we are looking at these assets, understanding what it is that we need to do. When we get to the point of having to reposition them, do major refurbs, consider things like, do we demolish, do we try and reposition and use as much of the existing structure? Circular economy really comes into play. And I think in London we saw an example recently in the news where I think planning permission was stopped quite late in the day because of that kind of thinking. So it's really rising up the agenda. And it's a question we've all got to ask ourselves. If we're going to do the work at the asset, how do we reuse as much as possible? But also when we're doing things like rooftop solar, you've got to also ask yourself, there's already a payback period associated with rooftop solar. If you have to do structural works as well, again, you have to think that you're increasing that payback period. So these topics absolutely rising up the agenda, regulations coming in, but they are things which we can slot into a well thought out net zero framework. But whole life carbon, I think, definitely is on moving the fastest. Biodiversity also not far behind. And hopefully EU taxonomy helps us out with the social value KPIs, because I think the market's hesitant on that and looking for guidance.
And Ria, it might be interesting, I mean, pick up any of those points. Sure. But I guess, how are you seeing it from LaSalle's point of view, in terms of the strategy for that? So are you looking at, right, how green are we? How can we move that forward? Is it about, trying to reduce the energy footprint? So I suppose practically, what are you thinking about in terms of moving forward and solving some of these issues?
Well, on the standing portfolio of assets that LaSalle, currently stewards, you need to first understand what your carbon footprint is. So in order to understand what your footprint is, you need to run a net zero carbon audit on every single asset. And then from that exercise, you really lay out an implementation strategy, a business plan, right? Of how do you decarbonize an asset, and each property type and scenario is different. It would be, you'll hear a lot in the market of being able to do things holistically, but it's very difficult to do something holistically when your occupancy is 95%, right? And the leases are going to slowly, maybe give back space, might renew. What do you do if you don't have a perfect situation where and what do you also do when the useful life of the boiler and the chiller has not reached its end of life? So there are trade-offs with each and every one of those cases in each and every property, with an eye towards trying to implement and accelerate and really do this. The other component that I think we're very focused on these days is really aligning the economics between landlords and tenants. So as a landlord, how do you get the incentive motivation buy-in from your occupant, whatever the building type may be, occupant, resident? What are you supposed to do? Because from our perspective, that's a downstream scope 3 emission that you want to manage. At the same time, you need the scope 2 on their end to figure out, right? So really, it is going to be a concerted effort between landlords and tenants to work cohesively, because the North Star is to try to decarbonize together. And then on the social side, I will say that we have ideas of what could be a socially conscientious move or an initiative, right? I think it's very difficult because it's very difficult to find something where you can compare apples to apples, year over year improvement, because in this instance, you're really trying to measure it over a long period of time. And then by either renovating a building or building a building, what are those moves that are really socially conscious within the immediate community, or what are those moves that one can do to improve the people that work there, live there? There's no easy quantifiable answer to that. So far, it's very much limited to measuring indoor air quality or taking surveys, but indoor air quality produces other challenges in and of itself as well. So there are moves, but they're very preliminary.
And I'd be interested to, that's interesting, I think, Rio. And it would be good to get a sense of, obviously there are things that can be done on a portfolio basis or an asset by asset basis, but certainly in the sessions that we've been having around cities and what they're looking for, they're also trying to create social value within an area and re-energize a part of the city. But that in a way means that they have to collaborate with often multiple investors who may have different views. Martijn, it'd be interesting because I know that you're trying to work together with different investors in different areas. So how complicated is that, or are people more open to it? And is that really necessary, looking to achieve what the city wants to achieve and actually implement some of these, social values?
Yeah, one of the investors we work with is obviously our mother company, Cofra, and they have this decarbonization plan and a mission and a vision that is projected on our own mission and vision. So I think that if we are not able to create the right changes to the assets for this decarbonization within that portfolio, if we can't actually perform that way, we cannot convince the other investor partners in other portfolios that it's possible. And a lot of them are really waiting for regulation, maybe until they need to do something. Some others don't really have a plan yet, I think. And it's really interesting to see that now taxonomy is coming and CSRD is coming, that they start to change their point of view. So sometimes it's 180 degrees turn, and they are suddenly pushing us instead of the other way around. So I think it will work through the whole chain, because everyone in the end will be confronted with CSRD, with ESG reporting, and maybe not for the SMEs, but the larger brands and companies that we have as tenants will need to comply to these regulations as well.
Okay, good. And Christina, just from a debt side, what are the kind of things that you are able to do? I mean, you mentioned that there are some things, but what are you able to do? Because obviously you'll be looking to green as well your debt portfolio, and you mentioned there that there was pressure from institutional capital as well. So I guess what initiatives are you putting in place at the moment?
Well, I think just going back to your point about working together, I think we've got a number of different client bases. You've obviously got the institutional borrowers who are already on the green agenda, and actually they're very easy to work with. The kind of the screening that we undertake is very easy for them to get on board, and it's they're actually we're learning from them as well as them them learning from us. More importantly for us as an agenda, we can help the less kind of institutional investors, or borrowers rather, who are more like family offices or smaller property companies, where we can help drive their kind of more sustainable or greening of their own assets. So you can bring them along with yourself on the journey. So these are people who don't have, when we meet them, they maybe don't even have a sustainable policy within the business. They don't have someone on the board who's got an ESG experience, but in order to take funding from us, they need to deal with that. So we're taking another level of the market to try and bring them along. I think that's really important on two levels. One is, we need to make sure that asset is refinanceable at the end of the loan. So we're all about preserving value. So we need to make sure that the borrower on the same journey makes sure that they're maintaining the value of the asset. So that's either attracting the right tenants, making sure that it's not stranded at the point of time it needs to be refinanced. And that's really important for us. But also, I think the fact that the second point is to bring everyone up on the same agenda together means that you are changing a much wider part of the industry, as opposed to just being an EPC rated A or BREEAM excellent. So we're trying to bridge the gap between the absolute grade A space and that secondary space, which is never going to get to grade A. And going back to embodied carbon, you can't knock down every building and rebuild it. It's not possible. So we also support assets that maybe won't get to net zero, but they will show a demonstrable improvement during the life of the loan. And that's kind of one of our key driving strategies, is to deliver that as part of the...
And that's interesting, I think, what are we aiming to do? I mean, we mentioned before at the start, Article 8, Article 9 funds, but are there also other elements in terms of social value, for example, social impact, where you can put those in place? It doesn't necessarily need to fit with an Article 9 fund structure, but actually it's still doing good. So it's still, helping support some social value in some way. So I don't know I don't know what you're doing in that sense, in terms of when you're developing, Adrian, are you looking at the area around that, how social value can be added? And it'd be interesting to get other people's views on that as well.
No, of course, Richard, yes. When we basically select potential acquisition of the land, inner city, we are starting, to analyze the neighbors, yes, and then definitely when we are at the stage of the process in acquisition and ownership of the land, then we start to have the conversation with each neighbor, yes, and somehow listen, yes, to what they are expecting by by having a new structure, new project, what kind of amenities they are requesting, yes. So there are different stakeholders, yes. You can have, multi-family project. You have to speak to some families to have some, playground for kids or some, fountains or something. And, you can have a retail developer next to your office building. So they would like to have maybe some kind of a common piazza, that can be, the flow of people can be maintained and they can actually benefit from, the workers in our building. Yes. So there are different interests taken into account, and we always look into that. This is one, of course, that's when it's not social. It's simply something which is embedded into our DNA.
I mean, it'd be interesting to pick up how people see that in terms of how they integrate that into the whole process that there is within your businesses. What are the challenges, and I suppose how far down the path are we?
So on the debt side, we're trying to look at an impact fund, and you think that delivering an impact through environment would be easier, but actually because of do no significant harm, it's very difficult to take assets on board below an A EPC rating. So the way that we're trying to deliver a social impact is through the social value. And what we're trying to do is address a social need. And that's in things like healthcare, living and education. But to your point, we have a data science team who are able to identify markets where are underserved. And that's the day one impact. That's easier to achieve than the kind of ongoing impacts during the life of the loan. And remember, as part of a fund, you have to have a clearly defined what's your impact. That needs to flow across all your investable themes, but your key performance indicators are slightly different. So your reporting measures also need to reflect the social value impact at the outset and during the life of the fund. So you're trying to match. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that you're just trying to put all the pieces together, and it's actually a bit of a headache. But I think we are definitely getting there, and with the support of the equity guys are kind of trailblazing for us. I think we'll be ready to launch it at the end of the year.
From an E perspective, it's what are those win-win situations, cost-benefit analysis. What is a net zero carbon intervention that you can do to really drive accretion, right, and risk return? So you're trying to figure out, okay, there's an accretive move you could do by considering air source heat pumps versus geothermal heat pumps. What's the cost? What's the return? What's the impact to tons of CO2 equivalent per area measure, right? To figure out the intensity. But again, that's just only like one facet of it, right? And yeah, I think that there are many interventions that are not straightforward, in the sense that you can apply one concept to an office building, it may not be applicable to industrial. You may apply a certain concept to industrial, totally has, it can't apply it to residential. So there's a lot of learning just by seeing what each and every one of those interventions are. That is why it's quite challenging, because there is no one silver bullet answer to any kind of solution. There are many, many ways of approaching it. I think that's what's challenging is, if you're counting from 1850, we're trying to figure out how to reduce 173 years worth of industrial emissions in 27 years' time. That's quite a challenge. It's quite a sobering challenge, right? So figuring that out and how to do it through an industry that really is engaged in it, but really how do you do that rigorously is probably the part that we're really trying to get smarter around as a company. And whether that's equity or debt, it's really trying to figure out those interventions and what works. What are the toolkits that you have to a certain type of property type?
And just it'd be interesting in terms of the transformation. Just Christine, how plausible is it that that's going to be funded by finance, for example? What's going to happen there? Because obviously there's a debt gap, obviously, because there will be assets that will be going on a stranded path, and intervention has got to be made, but we all know that intervention is going to cost money. So somebody's got to either put it in as CapEx, or somebody's got to come in and take a loan from somebody like you in order to be able to do that. So is that the practical solution? Are we going to end up with a bigger issue further down the line? What's everybody's sense of that? I mean, it'd be interesting to get your point on it as well.
Absolutely, and I think every lender wants to deliver an environmental improvement through its CapEx program. The problem is the financing costs associated with a transitioning asset in terms of the risk reward that lenders want to see aren't at the current time is quite hard to deliver. And in a market where arguably values have still some way to go, you don't want a structure where you're either rolling up the interest charge or you're having to get a deferred exit fee in order to get the right returns. So whilst lenders do like repositioning assets, and actually in a market where values are potentially falling, having that kind of business plan or a CapEx improvement which can be defensible in terms of further value falls is actually difficult to make the kind of numbers, the maths work. But so there's a balance a little bit of that at the moment, and I think there's probably less transactions happening because of that, the maths really needs to play out a little bit, if I'm honest.
Did you want to pick that
Yeah,
up?
I mean, this is the exciting stage, right? This is the problem-solving piece. We're all going out there and getting the data. We're doing decarbonisation audits. We've already had a lot of utility data for reporting purposes. It's not often the economy gets a close to a dead cert. We know fossil fuels are being phased out. The question is when and with what technology. So business sense is to get ahead of that and make sure you're doing it in a timely way before supply and demand issues when it comes to accessing the technology you need to do it becomes constrained. So I think we know which direction we're heading. The challenging bit, which is that exciting piece of how do you have that conversation? How do you make that work in the business sort of case? How do you share the costs? You were talking about occupiers earlier. Can you share the cost with those occupiers? That collaboration piece. Could you share it with some investors? It's having those conversations, but you can't have those discussions until you have the data. And the data needs to tell you what technology do I need to change? How much is it likely to cost? When's the best time to do it? When you've got that, you can get around the table with the asset managers, the portfolio team, and you can really start to think that through. And that, to me, is exciting. It's a question of when do we do this? How do we spread it out? The sooner we know it, the more time we have to action it. And those conversations, because I think your point's absolutely right. It's the whole definition of sustainability is it's local. You've got to look at what's right. What's the right renewable technology where that asset's based? What's the right, for the sector, for the country, all the different things you have to consider. And having that conversation, that's the intelligent piece. That's the bit where the brains and the thinking really have to come together. And that's where we all are. And making that work, that's the exciting piece. But it's a challenge. It's not going to be easy.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'm quite interested into this because at some point there will be, lots of buildings. You call it stranded assets, yes, that will be in the need of, as you say, repositioning or some kind of, any other ways to somehow bring the life into the building. And the fundamental question, besides, you go to the debt. If you want to go to the debt, you need to show that you have an income.
Yeah.
Yes, and if you have a building which is stranded, you have no income. Yes, so how can you secure financing if you have no income? So what you have to do, you have to put equity. If you have to put equity, equity will be 15, I don't know, maybe 20%. So how feasible is that? Yes, to do it. I mean, it's like chicken and the egg. Yes, you want to do, refurbishment of the building, maybe change office into, I don't know, residential, whatever. But maybe even keep an office, but just upgrade it, yes, to a carbon, proper standard and ESG. But how to do it if you cannot secure a lease? Maybe you can, answer the question, like how to secure a tenant on the building and promise him delivery, and just do it everything from, maybe from the equity, and only then, having a tenant, you can pull some financing.
Fundamentally, it comes controversially back to the cost of finance, the cost and the yields. And at the moment, the maths doesn't work. So either finance costs have to come down, or yields have to move further out. And I know no one wants to hear that, but you're right. The mathematical puzzle doesn't really work because funding those capex costs, lenders don't want to take the risk. They want to be paid for the risk, like you want to be paid for the risk as equity. We want to be paid for the risk. We see the benefits of having a better asset at the exit, but we still need to pay for the risk. And at the moment, the numbers don't. The numbers that we need to pay for the finance means that equity gets hurt and you don't get the returns you need, and nor do we. So either finance costs have to come down, or I'm afraid yields have to move out further. That's kind of where we are. And maybe the costs of doing those capex work.
It would be interesting to just pick up with you, Rui, just as a final point. Do you think that I had an interesting discussion at MIPIM actually, where somebody said we would know when there was a fundamental change when on panels people were saying, I have X dollars under management and X amount of carbon in my portfolio. Then you would know that the data was there, and also people were actively beginning to think about continuing to put the assets under management up, but reduce the carbon levels. So it'd be interesting to see whether that will begin to change. But also intriguing to see whether in the US, because obviously here in Europe it's very much being driven by regulation. And you mentioned the sort of carrot slightly more than the stick. And does that mean that the market is actually getting behind that? For us in Europe, we sort of occasionally wring our hands in horror looking at the US, perhaps in some ways in terms of the sort of, particularly the environmental side, maybe. We think we're dreadful at biodiversity when Asia is great at it, and we think you're fantastic at diversity in the workplace and those kinds of things, which we're not particularly good at. But is that fair, or is the market actually voting with its feet and moving in that direction anyway?
Well, I mean, there are many forms of carrots, whether that's C-PACE financing on a debt level, whether that's tax incentive through the Inflation Reduction Act, but even at a national level, there are many local, state level tax incentives and cost basically subsidies that advocate for all sorts of renewable energy projects or energy efficiency measures, and the C-PACE financing is a mechanism that's really from the 0 to 20% of the cap stack that you pay back through the property taxes, right, through a property tax assessment. So it's a very unique mechanism of how you finance energy efficiency measures. Again, it's trying to be creative with various types of measures of the capital structure, but certainly it helps if your cost basis is lower, right, just by virtue of that. One thought about what you guys were talking about, just to turn that on an optimistic note, for new capital, right, it hasn't been better, right? It's kind of like, wow, things haven't been this inexpensive or potentially gonna be inexpensive. Your going in cost basis is gonna be reasonable, and you could do your net zero carbon CapEx to its fullest without, you'll still value engineer and estimate and understand stuff, but you can do more and still be at a reasonable all-in cost basis, right? So that's an opportunity. And you're not, you don't have to, the air isn't getting thin, the underwriting isn't like backed into a corner, it's reasonable, right? That's nice, right? In terms of an opportunity set. And so, yeah, there's a window here where that all of these types of recapitalizations are a unique moment in time that net zero carbon could have a way to really affect that in a more than a small way. So that's one thought. But yeah, I think that it's just really it will help. It certainly helps to advocate for all sorts of on-site renewable energy, various types of carbon removal activities, all sorts of ways of figuring out just the equation that goes behind the building calculus of how do you motivate people to do this. So,
and I like the fact that we've ended on a positive note there. And I've got an admission to make to everybody, which is I've got you all here under false pretenses, which is you thought you were coming here for a fascinating panel around implementing ESG strategies, which indeed we have had and which has been great. But actually, what I've failed to mention is that Impact was actually launched at EXPO Real, and in fact, Redevco and Skanska were both on the editorial board, and Robbie is a new member of the editorial board, which is great. So you're actually here for a birthday party, really. So I'm just going to introduce Ron, who can just mention a little bit for those who don't know in 2 minutes around what it is, whilst I organise the drinks, which is going to be important. So over to you, Ron. Here is a clicker. Or do you want me to stay? Oh, what? Okay. Well, do you want to share mine?
No.
No. In fact, you are literally going to be speechless now.
Decapitated.
Yeah. No, that's great. Well, whilst we've still got this time, because one thing I didn't pick up, Martin, was carbon. 2 seconds? Oh, we're not going to deal with carbon pricing in 2 seconds, are we? That would be too harsh.
1 second.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, here we're here. Yeah, we have only 6 mics, so it was a little bit of a technical issue, like, shall we kill Adrian or sneak in and then put the device off, and that's not a good plan.
Not when we've been discussing social value, I think that would
He
be...
needs more than 2 seconds.
No, and I was thoroughly enjoying this discussion, and indeed, it's a little bit of a celebration. And there are the first glasses of champagne and white wine. Let's start with the speakers, because I think they did a great job. Maybe a big applause for the speakers. Great. Because I want to share something. We have something to celebrate and also to launch. And it all started 2 years ago. when we launched a preview version of Impact. And it was actually an idea to create a journal which is about purpose-driven knowledge, inspiration, and also alignment in the value chain. Because I think we believe it's all about collaboration and also driving change. And when we made this roadmap, it was like, okay, it should be a commercial brochure. It should be really about thought leadership. Let's do a deep dive on the existing stock. Let's do a focus on the future value, highlight ESG, and also try to focus on items like valuation, which are very important. So it was really a little bit like, well, in terms of being motivated, let's try to make a leading industry initiative. And indeed, I'm absolutely thrilled to announce that indeed CBRE Investment Management, welcome to the family. And yeah, we have, I think, a great family of impact members. So it started with this photo, and it was actually well, we don't like it because it's not about diversity. But when we look at it now, it's really a diverse family where I also would like to highlight Nicole Dines, who is the editor-in-chief of this brilliant journal. So also, big applause for Nicole. And actually what we would like to discuss today, and that's a little announcement, that when we look at the journal, we try to empower also the young professionals to speak out, because those guys and girls are thought leaders, industry leaders, but also we would like to give a room for young professionals to share their ideas. And we already were at COP26. We will be at COP28 with a Dubai event in collaboration with PwC. And we are actually trying to create something bigger. And it started already online with our LinkedIn community. But what we would like to announce, and I will skip it because we need some drinks. Let me skip it. Yeah. Because I would like to skip and highlight that we see more and more wishes to do a deep dive on country level and also asset level. So it's extremely valuable to meet like-minded people in your asset class or like-minded people in a country. And that's the reason why we thought we should launch a impact community. So after the journal, we are quite ambitious. And this is actually the roadmap for the community, where we will, next to the online and cast, will create a impact academy, where we will collaborate with the 20 leading universities of the world to share there also reports and articles about ESG and impact strategies. We will give room for thought for the young leaders and also the board members. And we will run the first dedicated Impact Summit next year. And also, and that's I think representative for Impact, Richard, it's also about collaboration. So we also try to align with other parties like ULI, like EPRA and SHA, because we think we should do it all together. Yeah, and also Shiena Golan from DWS is one of the green leaders who will also speak out and driving this community forward. So I would like to raise the glass and actually create a family photo together, because we should celebrate today. So let's make a photo. I will remove the mic.
Great.